15 years ago this week, on June 7th, 2006, King of the Ring 93 was not the only WWE event to take place this week in history from the Nutter Center in Dayton, Ohio. WWE aired a special on USA Network called WWE vs. ECW Head-to-Head, which featured matches between WWE stars and other WWE stars who were associated with the ECW brand, which they were getting ready to relaunch. This was basically a go-home show for the second One Night Stand pay-per-view. Matches included Rob Van Dam over Rey Mysterio, Mickie James over Jazz, Big Show winning a Battle Royal, Edge beating Tommy Dreamer in an Extreme Rules match, and what a main event, the first ever meeting between John Cena and Sabu in an Extreme Rules match that ended via disqualification when Big Show broke up Cena's STF. A lame finish for what is supposed to be an Extreme Rules match. This would not be the last time that Cena and Sabu would be in the ring together. They had one more match at the Vengeance pay-per-view the following month. An Extreme Lumberjack match that Cena won. Sabu told Chris Van Vliet earlier this year that he enjoyed working with Cena. This is what he said. "I liked it. I got a lot of bad information given to me about him. It was all lies and jealousy. He was a nice guy, he wasn't selfish, and he would call my spots when I forgot them. He didn't call most of the match, but when I got lost, he called it. We both called the match in the dressing room, and then we both called the match in the ring, but I would forget. He was like, do this, do that. He was always on the right page." Reminds me of the old WCW theme music for Sting. Remember, Man Called Sting? He does this, he does that. Anyway, just amusing myself now. A few days later, on June 11th, WWE presented its second One Night Stand pay-per-view with Rob Van Dam beating John Cena in the main event to become the new WWE champion. What an atmosphere in the Hammerstein Ballroom that night. That's where the famous "If Cena wins, we riot" sign, the whole meme, comes from. I still laugh at the fans throwing Cena's t-shirt back at his face every time he would throw it into the crowd. I do miss crowds like that. 2 days after that, on June 13th, WWE relaunched the ECW brand with a show on the Sci-Fi Network that saw the debut of The Zombie, who was promptly caned to death by the Sandman and never heard from again. This was part of Sci-Fi's edict that they wanted science fiction characters on the show. Little trivia note, the Zombie was played by the late Tim Arson, who was the first person I ever interviewed on my show. Sound off episode 129. Rob Van Dam was also presented with the revived ECW Championship, holding it and the WWE title at the same time. 14 years ago, on June 11, 2007, WWE held its annual draft lottery on Raw, but the big angle came at the end of the show, when Vince McMahon, on Mr. McMahon Appreciation Night no less, stepped into his limousine and it exploded with him inside. WWE reported on his death as if it were real. There were people in the building that night who called the police. People in the surrounding neighborhood who heard a loud explosion and saw a car on fire and off in the distance. They called the cops as well. Even Vince McMahon's good friend Donald Trump, the future president of the United States, was duped into thinking that Vince McMahon may actually have been blown to smithereens. Triple H appeared on the Opie and Anthony show the following year, and he was talking to Sam Roberts when he admitted that even the Donald himself called their office the next day to ask if Vince was okay. Unfortunately, it also upset their shareholders and their business partners after WWE issued a press release the very next day that read in part, "Although full details have not been disclosed, initial reports indicate that Mr. McMahon is presumed dead. An official investigation into Monday night's events is currently underway, with no one being ruled out as a suspect." 2 weeks later was to have been the funeral for Mr. McMahon on a special 3-hour edition of Raw. That was until Chris Benoit and his family were found dead that night, and the whole storyline was scrapped. 12 years ago this week, on June 13th, 2009, Japanese legend Mitsuharu Misawa died in the ring just days shy of his 47th birthday, tagging with Go Shiozaki against Bison Smith and Akitoshi Saito for the Noah promotion that he helped form. Misawa had not been feeling well leading up to this. Saito dropped him with a back suplex, and immediately Misawa told the referee that he couldn't move, and then, just as quickly, he passed out. They didn't have doctors at ringside back then, and people realized something was very wrong when they asked over the PA system if there was a doctor in the building who could help, which there was, but there was nothing that could be done. Bison Smith, who was in the match, was on Colt Cabana's podcast in September of 2011, 2 months before he died from heart issues at 38 years old. But he said that he looked down, he saw that Misawa's face was blue, and he said what happened is that when he landed on the suplex, he snapped his neck at the base of his skull and was automatically a quadriplegic, which would explain why he told the referee he couldn't move. And then he couldn't breathe. He couldn't breathe on his own, which led to cardiac arrest, and he died. The police report had his cause of death as cervical spinal cord trauma. At the time, the Observer claimed that he shattered his C1 and C2 vertebrae, which meant that his head and his spine were no longer connected. Basically, an internal decapitation. That video is one of the saddest things that I've ever seen. You know, with all the wrestlers crowding around him while the doctors are giving him CPR in the ring, and the fans are just, you know, obviously in shock, and they're just in despair watching on from the crowd. Kenta was there. He's leaning in trying to see what's going on. Women in the audience are crying and shrieking. Just awful. Misawa's matches with Kawada and Kenta Kobashi, those are the ones that get talked about the most. They are as brutal as they are legendary. He wrestled a hard style, and that style, unfortunately, caught up with him. It wasn't that, you know, he died from a suplex. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. It was years and years of abuse to his body that, unfortunately, just caught up with him. 11 years ago this week, WWE aired a special 3-hour viewer's choice episode of Monday Night Raw on June 7th, 2010. This was before 3-hour Raws became the norm. Although, as I said on the sound-off at the time, these 3-hour Raws, even then, were becoming painful to sit through. Matches on the show were determined by a live fan vote. So basically Taboo Tuesday, but on a Monday. The show sucked for the first 2 hours and 45 minutes, probably. It was a terrible show, which only made the show closing angle that much more jarring. This is still one of the best angles that WWE has ever pulled off. The Nexus Invasion of Raw, which I'm sure by design very much mirrored the NWO invasion in WCW. WWE expected that Rey Mysterio was going to win the fan vote to challenge John Cena in the main event, so you'd have two baby faces in the ring. But, surprise, surprise, CM Punk, who was a heel at the time wearing a black lucha mask, got 45% of the vote to Mysterio's 32% and 23% for Jack Swagger. I think the biggest shock is that Jack Swagger got 23%. Now I'm wondering if the vote was rigged. Although he was the World Heavyweight Champion at the time, but still. Cena was the WWE Champion. During the main event, NXT talent from Season 1 of the NXT television show showed up at ringside and surrounded the ring, led by NXT Season 1 winner Wade Barrett, with Daniel Bryan, David Otunga, Justin Gabriel, Michael Tarver, wearing a face covering, way before the CDC told him to do so. Skip Sheffield, a.k.a. Ryback, Heath Slater, and Darren Young. They proceeded to attack Cena. They attacked Punk when Punk tried to fight them off, but he couldn't. I actually like that. I like the fact that the heel came in also trying to fight these guys off. I think that added a lot of realism to it. They beat up Justin Roberts. They beat up Matt Stryker. They attacked Jerry Lawler. Then they overturned the announce desk on top of him. Michael Cole ran away. I remember thinking that maybe they were going to reveal that he orchestrated the entire thing because he was the one that got away. He got off scot-free. They destroyed the ring. They ripped up the canvas to reveal the plywood boards underneath. It was just pure chaos. It was so well done. Cena got stretchered out. Justin Roberts, in his book, Best Seat in the House, had this to say about the angle. Within a half hour of when doors were about to open, a giant black curtain was hung around the ring that blocked everybody from seeing inside. Arn Anderson was grabbing talent, mostly the newer guys from the NXT show who were still training in FCW, and bringing them behind the curtain. As I was about to leave, he looked at me and said, "You too." Maybe I needed to see how an ending was going to go down so that I can make a complicated announcement. I usually didn't like to see how things were going to end because I liked being genuinely surprised so that my reaction would make for a natural announcement. I overheard Arn say, "You'll get in the ring, Cena and everyone else, and the very last thing is, you'll get him." And he pointed at me. He has never been touched, but tonight even he is not safe. Rip his suit off and take him down. He will be the final victim before we go off the air. 4 days later, Daniel Bryan was released by WWE stemming from this angle. Stemming from his choking of Justin Roberts with his own necktie, which violated the company's PG policy of no choking. Unless, of course, you're doing a choke slam. Then I guess it's okay. But it was also his spitting in John Cena's face that got him fired. On Talk Is Jericho in 2014, Bryan said that when they each took turns attacking Cena, before he kicked him in the head, he spat in Cena's face. And when they got to the back, someone from WWE asked, "Who choked out Roberts with the tie?" And Bryan said, "That was me." And then someone shouted, the same person, I assume, shouted, "We don't choke anybody, you can't do that." And then they asked, "Who spit in Cena's face?" And Bryan said, "Well, that was me. That was me too." And they told him, "There's no spitting." And I'm thinking, what is this, public transit? There's no choking, there's no spitting on the bus. Later in the week, he spoke to Vince McMahon, who reassured him that it's all going to blow over, it's not a big deal, everything will be fine. And then 2 days later is when Vince McMahon personally called to tell Bryan that he had to let him go. So somebody got to Vince McMahon, whether it was a sponsor or probably a sponsor, let's be honest. Somebody got in his ear and they had to take action, and that was the action they took. And Bryan said he didn't sound too bothered by it, he being Bryan, and he told Vince, "I'm going to go make more money than I've ever made in my life on the indie scene." And he says the comment took Vince McMahon back a little bit. He wasn't expecting that. He was probably still on a developmental deal, I assume Bryan was at the time, so I wouldn't be at all shocked that he would have made more on the indies that year than probably working for WWE. But that's where Bryan went back to. He went back to the indies until WWE brought him back 2 months later as a surprise on Team Cena against the Nexus at SummerSlam, the night the Nexus died. They had something. They really had something with that group, and they killed it. Even John Cena admitted after the match backstage to Edge and Chris Jericho that it was a mistake to bury those guys the way that he did at the end of that match. He has since, when asked, said that he comes to work and does what he's told. He's gotten over the years questions about this at like Comic-Con, WizardCon, whatever, events like that. And that's his answer. He goes, "Look, I show up, I do what I'm told. I don't have the power to change the television show. I don't have the power to control who wins and loses." But he did have the power to dictate how the finish of that match went down. And if he had it to do all over again, the match would have gone very differently. 5 years ago this week, on June 8th, 2016, Andrade Cien Almas made his in-ring debut at NXT TakeOver The End with a win over Ty Dillinger. Andrade's WWE career recently reached the end. And now, hey, he can recreate his TakeOver debut in AEW with Shawn Spears. The Revival, also now in AEW, I'm sensing a pattern here, reclaimed the NXT Tag Team titles in an excellent match against American Alpha. And Samoa Joe handed Finn Balor his first loss in the Demon Paint in a steel cage match for the NXT Championship. I don't believe that Balor has lost a match as the Demon since. I think that was the only time. And 3 years ago this week, on June 9th, 2018, New Japan Pro Wrestling hosted its Dominion show from Osaka-jo Hall, highlighted by Kenny Omega ending the 720-day reign of Kazuchika Okada to win the IWGP Championship 2-1 in a 2 out of 3 falls match. This was the fourth and final epic between these two and one of the greatest matches that I've ever seen. For a 65-minute match, I was never bored. And Chris Jericho won the 10th Intercontinental title of his career. His first in New Japan, the other 9 came in WWE, beating Tetsuya Naito. When this event was over, both of New Japan's top champions were from Winnipeg. And I know Jericho wasn't born there, but he was raised there as a kid. 2 Canadians holding the top titles in New Japan. And don't forget, at that time, as I checked the champions roll call, Young Bucks were the tag team champions, Michael Elgin was the never openweight champion, and Jay White was the United States champion. I just find that all very amusing. And that is this week in wrestling history.